Welcome to This Old Town Collector's Edition with Alan Orange. We'll be traveling back through Long Island history with some encore presentations of This Old Town segments. And this time, much of our travel will be on the water. We'll take whaling boats, ferry boats, cargo boats, even rum boats. For Long Island, as its name implies, is both an island and a large one at that. As a result, it made its living and much of its lore from the sea that surrounds it. 100 years ago, much of that living and most of that lore came from a massive mammal called the whale. Long Island, after all, boasted two of the major whaling ports in the world. One was a picturesque village on the North Shore. Cold Spring Harbor is still picturesque, though time has silenced its shrill call, "Thar she blows." If you're casting about for a tranquil Long Island town, you might well settle on Cold Spring Harbor. It borders a sweet bay of beauty, as one author put it, and even its main street meanders mildly. But it wasn't always so calm in this old town. In the days when men went whaling on tall ships, Cold Spring Harbor was the 25th largest whaling port in the country. Men left on journeys of 2 to 4 years and received only $300 and sometimes a grave at sea. The wives left behind often had little money, it was held by the tavern keepers, and some supplemented that allowance with less than noble pursuits. A cannon, now at the Whaling Museum, would explode when the men returned, and so would the town itself, so much so that Main Street was dubbed Bedlam Street, and the top floor of this one-time inn was filled with drunk sailors, two in a bed behind the slit windows. When the whaling era ebbed, Cold Spring Harbor traded on its charm. City tourists took to its old houses, like the one on Main Street, with the inside chimney built on a spiral to trap any unwanted witches. They stayed at a shoreful of hotels or bought their own residences, most notably the Kahns of Ohika and the Tiffany's, whose artist patriarch created the magnificent windows of old St. John's Church. The past is still very present in Cold Spring Harbor. Lockwood's General Store, around for a century, now just houses less general stores. And Vinny the Barber, around for 30 years, explains what the past means to townspeople.
Everybody likes to live in the past. And it's speculated it was really much better than it is now, which we all know it wasn't.
Cold Spring Harbor is 339 years old. What is the secret of its longevity? Well, some would say that it's kept the spirit of those original whalers. What got them through their original journeys, one of them wrote, was, "Looking forward to the time when your heart may be made glad with the sight of your native land again." Now, whaling was also at the heart of another Long Island town, but so was something else, money. The boats sailed from Sag Harbor for whale, but they also landed to unload major cargo. Now, that's why Washington put a customs house in the town, as opposed to Freeport, for example, which remained a small free port. And that's why Sag Harbor did double collection of whales out at sea and taxes back on shore. Take a spin around Sag Harbor, and you'll find as much past as present, much to stop you in this old town. For example, visit the first customs house, where they stopped a lot of people from 1789 on. Washington declared that Sag Harbor and New York City would be entry points, with D.K. Deering, a prominent villager, in charge of collecting Sag Harbor fees. Before income tax, imagine such days, these were the major revenues, as items like soap, snuff, and shoes were taxed at a rate of pennies per pound. Pounds of a different sort, whale pounds, fueled the town's economy a century later. Sag Harbor was a global whaling port. Whaling ships were the original American melting pot, with colonials, Native Americans, and African Americans setting steel into creatures that preceded them all. To pass the time at sea, Sag Harbor sailors fashioned scrimshaw from whalebone, including a swift to hold their ladies' yarn and objects now worth more than $10,000. Speaking of the women, they would wait and watch for years, climbing to the widows' walks atop the houses to search for returning sailors. This one on Main Street is the last in town. Such romance and richness also attracted writers. James Fenimore Cooper, who owned a whaling vessel, set 2 novels in the area. The better known, especially from the movies, was the adventure Last of the Mohicans. More recently, writers like John Steinbeck found the seclusion of Sag Harbor to their liking.
He used to tell me he used to go on tours. In other words, a tour to him was to get into an old station wagon, go up in the woods, and do his writing. He had an old typewriter bolted on the back end of the station wagon, and his dog was always with him. And he'd sit up there and type, and finally we got disgusted, fold everything up, and come home.
This home was the cradle of another kind of writing. Long Island's first newspapers started in Sag Harbor. Notice the anchor to windward, by the way, for good luck. The first paper, Frothingham's Long Island Herald, published in that house. Even then, ads dominated, but in addition to news, there were essays, poetry, and philosophy. And the newspaper tradition continues. The town, after all, was a harbor, a haven to many during its 246 years, from those who set to sea on ships to those who set down words on paper. One journalist in the 19th century said that either Sag Harbor or Brooklyn would become a major metropolis. Now, Brooklyn, of course, did become a major city, or at least part of one. Sag Harbor, at least these days, wouldn't have it any other way. When we return, some other dangerous sides of the sea. They aren't whaling, but they provide a whale of a tale. Stay with us. For more Long Island history, here are some sites you can visit. The African American Museum focuses on the black experience and contribution. The Cradle of Aviation Museum features aircraft from the start of flight to the space age. Garvey's Point Museum is devoted to Long Island geology and prehistory. The Long Island Maritime Museum sails through sea history. Joseph Lloyd Manor is restored to its pre-revolutionary high style. The museums at Stony Brook feature a famed carriage and art collection. Old Bethpage Village has a score of historic buildings moved to that site. Old Westbury Gardens mixes Georgian architecture and English gardens. The Sag Harbor Whaling Museum returns to the tall ship days. Sagamore Hill was the summer White House of Theodore Roosevelt. The Vanderbilt Museum and Planetarium features the collections of William K. Vanderbilt. The William Floyd Estate is the birthplace of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And the Walt Whitman House is the 19th century home of the good gray poet. Welcome back to This Old Town. This time we are all at sea, discussing how maritime matters made a difference in Long Island history. At times, they made a dangerous difference, even a deathly difference. Wrecks and rescues at sea were part of the risk and part of the history of towns like Patchogue. As you journey toward Patchogue, consider its name. It comes from the Indian Pachug, turning place, because you had to turn there on journeys. And getting places, transportation, has always been central to this old town. If you come by road, remember that the stagecoach made a major stop here. We breakfast at Patchogue at 10, wrote one journal keeper, after leaving Babylon just after daylight. Even the gypsy wagons made camp here. If you come by train, consider that the depot is deep in history. Patchogue was a terminal point, and the coaches, like cabs, lined up for the ride east. Among the arrivals were British lace makers who found the rail transport perfect for a new business. They transformed the town with a lace factory and spent wartime making camouflage and parachutes. Finally, if you arrive by sea or for the sea, you'll see the spot that brought the toughest times. So tough, town volunteers formed a life-saving service, which later became the Coast Guard. When ships ran aground, these volunteers ran to them, or at least ran line to them, shooting with a Lyle gun, then pulling forward on a breeches buoy. One of the worst sea disasters, painted by S.A. Anderson, was the grounding of the Louis V. Place in a snowstorm, with men frozen to the mast. 7 of those sailors didn't survive, and were buried by the Smith sisters, town residents who owned a clothing store, but also owed something to others, they said. The sailors' graves are still there, one part of the special Lakeside Cemetery on Main Street. Its centerpiece is the Smith sisters' monument, perhaps unique in the country. Its 4 sides contain a genealogy from 1649 to 1909 of every member of the Smith family down to the finest detail. Not just birth date, but Wednesday, 1:20 p.m. Not just death, but how, drowning. Not just lifespan, but purpose. He read the Bible through 89 times. Even one who's alive now, third line, as these walls of words are alive now. So on water, on road, and on rail, Patchogue has rolled through a very moving history. Now that is one of the more interesting historic cemeteries on Long Island, and perhaps the most interesting historic tombstone is the one you saw. Let's move on, though, from the dangers of the seas to what we might call the daring of the seas. Unfortunately, it was daring to benefit illegal activity. At least at the time, the 1930s, liquor was illegal. And Long Island, so close to Manhattan, was a favorite smuggling spot. The favorite route was the sea, and the favorite landing point was probably Greenport. It's high tide along Main Street, Greenport, a flood of tourists at the height of the summer season. And yet it's not the first discovery of this old town. The railroad discovered it first in 1844, extending to Greenport and making it a major hub. The inaugural party, wrote one eyewitness, involved 40 baskets of champagne and half a case of brandy. The many stupidly inebriated, he wrote, had to be put back on the cars to New York. Hard to imagine, looking at the closed station. But the idea then was to start at Brooklyn and pick up riders all the way to Greenport, then transfer them to steamboats like the Long Island and take them to Connecticut where they could retrain for Boston. But that meant clanging through Suffolk farmland, where one woman soaped the rails because her cow was hit, and engines would sport the antlers of all the deer who'd become trophies. A little later, some discoveries by this man, artist-inventor Frank Hartley. A Greenport resident, he invented this life motion projector, and at about the same time as Edison, created the earliest motion pictures, which he called kintography. He displayed the results for 9 years at the Greenport Opera House, dazzling audiences with his wonderland of motion pictures. Oh, and he also marketed his own phone system at $9 a year to 70 residents of Greenport. Speaking of port, or any hard drink, the town's piers and coves were perfect for rum running. Claudio's, a longtime restaurant, now has a paved parking lot. But during Prohibition, boats with booze could row right under the main floor, and bartenders, supposedly serving soda and water, could yank a trapdoor and grab the harder stuff. Then, where the stereo system is hidden now, a dumbwaiter would deliver the contraband another floor up. Townsfolk were paid $10 to unload midnight boats. Then trucks and cars with machine gun escorts would head toward the city, sometimes upended by ambushes from other gangsters, sometimes upended by crafty cops. So Greenport has lived a very spirited life. The railroad brought the spirit of adventure. Hartley brought the spirit of invention. And the rum runners, well, they brought the strongest spirits of them all. And finally, a town that spans maritime history. Early on, it became famous for sending ships to sea. And recently, it became famous for trying to span that sea. From start to finish, Port Jefferson has sailed through history. Travel into Port Jefferson and you travel downward. You suddenly understand its original name, Drowned Meadow, from the days of rain and runoff. For the rest of its soggy history, skid to a stop in this old town. Waters, after all, were what buoyed Port Jeff in the whaling days. The town built ships far more than sailed them. Ships of all sizes, a score at a time in the 1850s, and ships of great strength during World War II. With sea ships came sea yarns, like the one about the Port Jeff crew of the 1860s that saved a downed air balloon and balloonists, or the one about the rum-running days of Prohibition, when an outlaw ship ran aground with booze that locals soon disposed of, or the many tales of nor'easters that left great ships as tipsy as rum runners. But for much of the past 90 years, the port's most prominent business has been ferrying. The ferry to Connecticut was started, legend has it, when Andrew Carnegie was angered at paying $250 to rent a barge. The ferry was almost replaced, on the other hand, by Robert Moses, who tried to substitute a bridge. No less than 8 sites, from Orient Point to Sands Point, were proposed to bridge the Sound. Port Jeff was one of the favored sites, but more favored was Oyster Bay, that is, until 6 years later, after some rather loud lobbying by citizens groups. In short, Robert Moses' vision stayed on the drawing board. So whether they build the bridge or not, water has bridged the generations here. For 331 years, from shipbuilding to sound crossing, water has flowed through the history of Port Jefferson. Now, they never did get those bridges built. In this case, as opposed to the story of the Exodus, the sea conquered Moses. To help us conquer our maritime topic, we'll be joined by the chairman of the Long Island Maritime Museum, Stan Feldman. So don't sail away. We will be back after these messages. Here are places to look for more information on Long Island history. Not all of these books, videos, and periodicals are in current distribution, but all are available at local libraries. And welcome back to this old town. We've been looking at the complex and often stormy relationship between the sea and Long Island. To help analyze that relationship, we're joined by Stan Feldman, the chairman of the Long Island Maritime Museum, and that's in West Sayville. Stan, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Let's begin with what we can call, I guess, the biggest aspect of this particular subject, and that's whales. We talked about how towns like Cold Spring Harbor and Sag Harbor had gained fame because of whaling. What happened to that whaling, at least as an industry here in Long Island?
Well, the whaling industry grew, and the vessels were coming in to Greenport and to Sag Harbor, and everything was going great until about 1857, 58, when petroleum was invented. And all of a sudden, you didn't need whale oil. And from that point, they just started diminishing and dying out.
Yeah, including the two main ports that were here.
Well, needless to say, you don't need Wales, you don't need Greenport, you don't need Sag Harbor for it.
Yeah, or Cold Spring Harbor. I guess there was another aspect of fishing that I only kind of touched on in passing, and that we ought to spend a little more time with, and that's oystering. Just how significant was that for Long Island?
Oystering was very significant, both on the North Shore and the South Shore. It was something that the Indians had done, and when the farmers came here, or they came to Long Island, the Dutch, this was another occupation for them. And again, Long Island was your oyster capital of the world. I mean, from Long Island, they packed oysters, and they were shipped by Long Island boats all over the world. And you had two primary points. One was Oyster Bay, and the other was the South Shore of Long Island, your area between Patchogue and Blue Point and West Sayville area, where a lot of oystering was done. Well, the hurricane in 1938, I believe, where created the Murchis Inlet, the salinity of the bay went up, and the oysters disappeared. So the only oystering that you now have on Long Island is over in, I believe it's Cold Spring Harbor, or in Oyster Bay.
In Oyster Bay, appropriately enough.
Where Flowers
right.
actually farms oysters.
Right, and still do. I was over there at one point, I guess for the Oyster Bay, this old town, and they were still working hard, but really the only spot, I think, on Long Island left for oystering.
It's the only place,
yeah.
And that's only because they're actually doing their own seeding and their own farming. You will not find any on the South Shore at all now.
We talked a lot about the shipwrecks in two or three of these pieces, and I guess the first thing that people want to know is how many shipwrecks really are there around Long Island? Are they massed in a particular spot?
There are over 600 shipwrecks off the North Shore and the South Shore. People seem to forget that there were shipwrecks in Long Island Sound. You have a number in there. The majority of the shipwrecks, though, are off the Fire Island area, from Montauk Point to Brooklyn, that entire length of island. There are over 600 that we know about that are recorded, and if anybody ever gets to the Long Island Maritime Museum in West Sayville, there is a map in the Coast Guard room depicting and showing where all these wrecks are.
I guess that's my next question. Just how accessible are these shipwrecks? For example, there are a number of people, some of them here, who are divers and who would dive for the wrecks. Are they accessible? Can they do that? Okay,
the most famous one is the San Diego, which is about 9 miles off Fire Island Inlet, sitting in about 110 feet of water. And that's a very popular place for the divers to go down and dive. Since these wrecks recorded from the 1600s on, you can imagine that a lot of these vessels have decomposed by now. So there are 3 or 4 or maybe 5 wrecks that can be dived on, the most famous being the San Diego. And again, I've got to caution, if you are going to dive on one of these, be a certified diver. Invariably, every year you lose 1 or 2 people, even experienced divers in these wrecks.
Now, is there any treasure waiting for people, you know, in these wrecks? You read about it occasionally in the newspapers. Is that the kind of thing they should look for?
This is not Key West. You're not going
or
to
Indy Jones.
Right. You're not going to find them. If there were any, they would have been picked clean by now. I think possibly the only one that came to note is one off of Montauk, I believe, where a vessel did go down in the 1700s, and gold sort of floated up for a while, and they found it on the beaches. But there hasn't been a find in the century that I know of.
But people still looking nonetheless.
Why not? You never know.
Yeah. Probably the biggest notice of treasure that I've heard about is Captain Kidd, whose treasure supposedly, I underscore supposedly, is buried on Gardiner's Island. Were pirates prone to ply the shores of Long Island generally?
Yes. Fire Island was a very good place for the pirates to hang out. They would set fires in the middle of Fire Island, hoping that people would think that was the inlet. And as they tried to enter in that area...
Seduce them in, huh?
That's exactly what they did. They seduced them in, they would founder on the shore, and the pirates go after the loot. Kidd supposedly had buried loot, treasure, on Gardiner's Island. And from there he went into New York City to become a merchant. None was ever found, and they're still digging. They still can't find it.
Mm-hmm. Let's move, I guess, to a different kind of pirating, and that's the people who brought the illegal liquors during the time of, I guess, the 1930s. How much of that was going on? We talked about Greenport. Were there spots other than Greenport where those kinds of pirates were at work?
Fire Island, the South Shore of Long Island. You had Jones Inlet, you had Fire Island Inlet, and this became another occupation for the baymen. The mothership, the load ship, would be 12 miles offshore in these old freighters, Liberty freighters, and they would go out with their very fast boats they were using Liberty aircraft engines on their boats. They would go out there, offload, and come right in the inlet. And they would disappear in all the little coves and all the other little rivers in Great South Bay. So there was a lot of rum running done during Prohibition. And of course, you know, Congress messed it up again, and they did away with Prohibition and put people out of work again.
So I'm assuming there were probably police all over the island at that time also. I mean, New York City police on the lookout. Well,
there were police, and there were Coast Guard. And one book that I read mentioned the fact that some of these people were on the take and looked the other way.
Some things don't change.
They never change. But there was a lot of rum running during that period of time.
Let me ask you about something that can drive one to drink, which is trying to make that long haul all the way around the Horn from Westchester to Long Island. Is that bridge ever going to be built?
Well, if it was going to be built for Allen, it's not going to happen.
You found me out.
I found you out. My personal opinion is that it will not be built, especially in today's day where you have so many environmentalists who have such control over what happens construction-wise in the United States. They're not going to allow a shoreline to be attacked. You know, God is not building any more waterfront. And I don't see that happening for that reason, number one. Number two, the cost involved in doing that would become today is very expensive, prohibitive. And where would you put this? 135, the Seafood Oyster Bay Expressway, was constructed with a bridge in mind to go to Rye. That never happened. Now they talk about building one from Greenport, Orient Point to Connecticut. How many people are going to travel that far to make it cost efficient? And, you know, there are some people who really don't want all that traffic going through. So my personal will never happen. It
won't happen. And I guess if it didn't happen with Robert Moses behind it, how likely is it that it'll happen now?
No, it won't. We don't have another maker like that.
Stan, that's all the time we have, I'm sorry to say. But I thank you very much for providing some answers, calming some waters in our journey through maritime history. And our thanks to those who helped create this Old Town Collector's Edition.